Most of the attention with phosphate mining is directed towards the phosphogypsum stacks. Everyone can agree they're the biggest threat the industry poses to the environment. But there's another facet of this industry that has a dirty little secret that gets very little coverage. We're talking about clay settling areas. This is where the industry dumps their leftover clay after they extract the phosphate rock. The process of extracting the rock is done in a beneficiation plant, usually located next to the mining site. There's very little known about this process because it rarely, if ever, gets investigated. The only study that we've seen about how the industry separates the phosphate rock happened 20 years ago in 2001. It was titled Fate and Consequences to the Environment of Regions Associated with Rock Phosphate Processing, and it was prepared by BCI engineers and scientists. Reagents, by the way, is just a fancy word to describe the additives that the industry mixes with the rock to get it to separate. The first step in this process is to float the phosphate rock in a mixture of fatty acids and fuel oil used as a collector. The phosphate industry uses about 120 million pounds of fatty acid and double that quantity of fuel oil per year. After the first step, the phosphate rock still contains 10 to 20% of sand. So further upgrading and sand removal requires a second flotation that is accomplished by floating the sand using a cationic collector. Before this can be done, the residual fatty acid and fuel oil must be removed using a sulfuric acid wash. There are dozens of other reagents used in this separation process, and they include ammonia, amines, acetic acid, alcohols, glycols, and terpenes. All total, the Florida phosphate industry spends about $50 million per year to purchase a range of beneficiation reagents, and it is speculated that the ultimate fate of up to 30% of these reagents is unaccounted for and may be released into the environment. For every ton of fertilizer produced, the industry uses about 4.7 pounds of fatty acid, 12 pounds of fuel oil, 4.3 pounds of soda ash, and 1.8 pounds of amines. The reagent that's the biggest concern is fuel oil, and when the phosphate industry separates the clay, sand, and phosphate rock, the clay absorbs 65 to 80% of all these reagents, so it's safe to say the clay settling areas is where most of the fuel oil and the other reagents end up. Clay is a coagulant, which means it sticks to impurities in water. That's why clay is used in water purification. Clay also absorbs radiation, and these clay settling areas are 4 times more radioactive than normal. They also give off radon gas, which we all know can cause cancer and harm the environment. The phosphate industry's separation process creates lots of clay, so they need thousands of acres of land to build these clay settling areas. They usually use mined out land, so as soon as they strip all the phosphate out, they begin piling up dirt to make dikes for the clay settling areas. There's so much clay left over when they're done mining a piece of land that the settling ponds take up about 40% of the total land that they mined. Most clay settling ponds are built with a land bridge down the middle of the pond. This is so the clay will settle on one side and give the water a place to move to the other side. As the clay builds up, the water creates rivers as it migrates to the other side of this pond. These phosphate mines are located right in the middle of citrus country, and it should concern you that your orange juice might be growing within a stone's throw of one of these ponds. These clay settling areas are 50 to 60 feet of solid clay. It will eventually dry on the surface and become crusty, but the clay underneath will never dry out, and rainwater will never be able to permeate this clay and resupply the aquifer. Here are a couple ponds that have set for a while. Plants do start to grow back, but these are not the plants that were here before, and this habitat will not sustain the creatures that once lived here, and as you can see, there is very little, if any, life in these ponds. Before these clay settling areas were here, this land was home to lots of wildlife, including threatened and endangered species like panthers, gopher tortoises, indigo snakes, wood storks, and snail kites. Our government is supposed to be protecting these species, but instead they issue permits to these companies and allow them to destroy their habitats. These areas will never support life. They will be permanent dead zones for decades, if not centuries, to come.